The New Frontier and a Great Society, Section 3, with Miss Loshy. Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson became president after Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. He took the oath of office on the plane back to Washington, D.C. after the assassination. His policies were known as a Great Society. His Great Society programs were largely unsuccessful and many Americans remained in poverty. Growing tension and division in the nation over the Vietnam War contributed to Johnson not running for re-election in 1968. Johnson was Kennedy's vice president, so when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson assumed office. He was the next in line for the presidency. The Great Society. The Great Society was the nickname for Johnson's goals and policies during his term as president. He wanted to improve the quality of life for Americans despite their national origin, race, religion, gender, etc. He wanted to end poverty, provide health care, improve education, and create greater racial equality. Despite these programs implemented by Johnson, many Americans remained in poverty. The Vietnam War caused much of the funding for these programs to be diverted. Diverted means to be taken in another direction. So the money that would have been used for the Great Society programs was being used for the Vietnam War effort instead. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a labor law. It outlawed discrimination against people based on their race, religion, color, sex, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an employment discrimination law, so it ended discrimination that would be in employment or for jobs based on a person's race, religion, color, sex, or national origin. Those cannot be used to say that a person was not eligible for a particular job. So the 64 Civil Rights Act ended discrimination in employment. The 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution made it illegal to force people to pay poll taxes in order to vote. This only applied to presidential and congressional elections. Particularly, poll taxes were being used to hinder or make it hard for African Americans and other minorities to vote. So since it only addressed presidential and congressional elections or national elections, it didn't address state or local elections. So that meant that poll taxes were still being used on the state and local level. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting. It guaranteed rights of the 15th Amendment by eliminating literacy tests and poll taxes. So the 24th Amendment gets rid of poll taxes on the national level with presidential and congressional elections. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 gets rid of poll taxes everywhere, state, local, and of course it reiterates the federal elections. But it also says that literacy tests are illegal, and literacy tests are when you had to prove if you could read or write, and they were really made it very difficult to pass. You were pretty much meant to fail these. And they also hindered African American voters as well. So with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it increased the number of African American voters, especially in the South. We will talk more about the 24th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 when we do our Civil Rights Unit. Affirmative action. Affirmative action was legislation that was passed in an attempt to prevent the discrimination of minorities, women, and the handicapped in both education and employment. At first, affirmative action was started with Kennedy. He passed an executive order that wanted to get more minorities working in the government, and then it starts to extend into private businesses and in education as well, and this results in the hiring and enrolling of more minorities, especially African Americans, in businesses and in higher education institutions such as colleges. Title IX, also called Title IX. This made it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their sex in educational programs that accepted federal financial aid. Title IX helped to increase the number of women attending college and participating in athletics. War on poverty. President Johnson initiated legislation in an attempt to reduce the nation's 19% poverty rate. War on poverty legislation included the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, Food Stamps Act of 1964, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and the Social Security Act of 1965. 19% poverty rate means that 19% of the US population was living in poverty, that they weren't able to meet their basic needs with food and housing. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was part of the War on Poverty. It was created to eliminate poverty, expand educational opportunities, increase the safety net for the poor and unemployed, and to provide health care and financial assistance to the elderly. Job Corps. The Job Corps program was another part of the War on Poverty. It provided free education and vocational training to anyone between 16 to 24 years old. Vocational training is you're learning a skill. So you're learning to weld, you're learning to build furniture, you're learning how to be a mechanic. You're learning some kind of skill, some vocational skill.